So the time has come to make our very first React component, the first of many, many to come, hundreds most likely, although this will definitely be the simplest, the least impressive of all of them, but it sets out a pattern we're going to follow. Now there are actually two main ways to write your components in React. You can write them using a class, and you can also write them using functions. So we're going to talk a lot more about this in the next video. All you need to know right now is that in this video, the very first component we create is going to be a class-based component. So we will be writing the class keyword, and we'll talk about it in this video. But if you have questions or you've heard of function components, that is coming up next. So for this example, there is a starter file, an index.html, that includes all the scripts. You can download it along with this video. If you don't want to type this out from scratch, you can also copy and paste it from the slides. I gave it to you because this is kind of annoying, and we are not going to be creating our React applications this way for very long. We'll use what I've already mentioned. It's called Create React App. It's a tool that takes care of installing React and getting everything set up for us. But for now, we're doing it the old-fashioned way. So there's a couple of things we have to talk about. The first is that we need to include React, of course, as a script. The second is that we need another script that also is part of React. It's called React DOM. So these two work together. We need both of them. It used to be that they were just one script. Early versions of React had both. They've since been split off. We need them. Also, I'm getting these scripts from CDN through unpackage.com. You could also download React and React DOM and link to them locally. Again, we're not going to stress about it because we'll be using Create React App in a little bit. So let's get started here. I have a new index.html file, and I'm just going to title it, let's say, first component. You could also just use the starter code, and then I'm going to add in those scripts that I need. So let's take those two first React and React DOM scripts, put them in there. Next, we need to include this third script, which is called Babel. We'll talk a lot more about why we need this in just a bit, but it has to do with that funky syntax where we can write HTML-looking tags directly in our JavaScript. That is not valid JavaScript. It's something called JSX. And in order for our computer, our browser, to make sense of it, it has to be compiled, or it's called transpiling, by Babel. So Babel is going to take that JSX and turn it into JavaScript. So we'll hear a lot more about that. And then the last thing we need is a script to our actual file where we'll type our component. Notice this right here. Type equals text/JSX. That is a super important little piece of information we have to include. So source is going to be index.js, or call your file whatever you want. In my case, I already have an empty index.js. Then we need to make sure type equals text/JSX. And this is going to signify whatever the contents are inside of this file. They might contain JSX syntax, things like this. This is not regular JavaScript syntax, but we'll be writing lines like this all the time in React inside of JavaScript files. So we have to signify this is a special flavor. All right, so now that we have the groundwork set up, we're going to define our component. And first, I'm just going to show you in the documentation, there's more than one way of writing a component. We can do what's called a function component, which usually is extremely simple. It's just a function, and it usually returns some HTML-looking JSX. So function components are nice and simple. We'll talk about them in the next video. Traditionally, they were not as powerful or as feature-rich as class-based components, but that is changing with the introduction of React hooks, which we spend a lot of time talking about in this course. But for now, we're working with class-based components. We can create a component using the class syntax. So every component we create will be class some name, and it extends react.component. The docs talk about how these two are basically equivalent from React's point of view, but classes have some additional features, so that's why we're going to be using class components throughout this course. Okay, so let's type our first one. Now it's going to be a very simple component. We want to, at the end, be able to render our component. We'll just call it hello. So right now, that's not going to work. I'm going to comment it out. I'm just going to delete it actually. But we're going to define our component called hello. So class hello extends, and it is conventional to use capital letters there. Class hello extends react.component, both of those capitalized. And then inside of here, the one thing we have to have, remember every component needs to know how to render itself, what to basically display. So we're going to add a render method that has to be there, and it's going to return something. So we could start simply. Let's return an H1 that says hello there, just like this. And we need to make sure we have a closing tag. Okay, so this is JSX, this is HTML looking stuff inside of JavaScript, and we'll save. Now, this on its own makes the component, but we're not actually using it. We're not putting it on the page. So now we need to make sure we have a place to put it. So in the starter code, I already gave you a div, and that div had an ID of root, as you can see right there. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create my div, root, and this is where we will insert, where we will render our component. So over here, we're going to type React DOM, so that's coming from that React DOM script, dot render, and we're going to tell it what to render. What component? A hello component. Okay, so let's do that now. Hello, and we have to make sure to add that closing slash. JSX does not like tags like this. We have to have that closing there. And then we need to tell it where to render. And so this is where we can do a document dot get element by ID, and we pass in that ID, which was root. Perfect. Now we can't just open this up as a file, as I mentioned in the last video, because Babel is not going to be happy. What we need to do is start a server. If you try just double clicking on the file, and you can see this is on the file protocol, you'll see what we get is this error that says basically access denied because of this CORS policy. We can't do that with Babel. We need to make sure that our stuff is served, essentially. So that's not going to work. Go back to the last video if you skipped it to learn how to start a server, or start your own server if you know how. So I'm going to go to my index file, open with live server. Now, just a reminder, you need to have a directory opened rather than a single file. So a directory like I have here, then we can use that live server extension, because it serves a whole directory. And there we go. It is showing up. We have our first component being rendered. Again, it's coming from here. Without this, if we comment it out, there's nothing showing up inside of our code or inside of our HTML. There's nothing to look at, but we've rendered our single hello component. Cool. So next, let's just play around a little bit with what we can do in here. So rather than just returning that single line, we can add parentheses and then add multiple elements in here. Now what we can't do, and this is sort of counterintuitive to a lot of students at the beginning, we can't just return 3 H1s or 3 individual elements like this. I actually get an error down here when I save from the extension I use. It says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. What that means is when we return something from a render method, we can return one element. Now it can contain a whole bunch of other tags. So if I want 3 hello there's, what I need to do is wrap them. So I could wrap them in a div or any other container, just something that I'm returning them all inside of. And then this will make that error go away. So we can return one thing only. It can contain a bunch of nested stuff. So now if I save, go back, here we go. This is my single component called hello that renders multiple things. You might be wondering, what if we want multiple hello components? Well, right now, there's not a great way of doing that. Typically what we do is have an app component as well, and inside of that app component, we would then have multiple hello components, and then we render a single app at the end. So we'll get to that. But that's all I'm going to do in this video, just show you the basic structure for creating a component. So we had a whole bunch of scripts to include, well, not a whole bunch, 3, and then our own script, and we have to make sure it's text/JSX. If we get rid of that, just to show you, and save, nothing shows up. We get a syntax error. It says, I don't know what the heck that bracket is. That's not JavaScript. And that's coming from right here. This first little line, that first HTML-like character. So we have to put that in there. Okay, so we're going to learn a lot more about components, but first in the next video, next section, we're going to learn a lot more about JSX. How can we style our JSX? How do we add JavaScript in variables and loops and conditionals? There's a lot of logic we can add inside of here. Pretty powerful stuff, so that's coming up next.